Relationships are going against our very nature. They're too emotional. They're too demanding. Why do men specifically struggle when it comes to emotional capacity and relationships? I spent many years struggling in relationships. As soon as it got to a couple of months in, I used to find them incredibly difficult. Lots of conflict, lots of stress. I would shut down, I wouldn't speak. We feel it's really confusing. We just want to give up. You're not stepping up as a man. This is how relationships are. None of these things are actually the real issues. The problem is a bit deeper and a bit harder to find. We don't learn emotional capacity. Staying there in the moment when the difficulty starts to arise, instead of shutting down, withdrawing, going silent. You're not broken. You're not doomed. It's not your fault. But why it is your responsibility to revert back to our childhood behavior. Tantrums. So you start screaming and shouting. Your brain goes offline. This is a tiny gap. Anything else that goes in just leaks out. You got to be willing to be in it, to grow it and make it bigger. If you can see that relationships are hard, dating is hard for you, then so men, why relationships hard, right? One of the things that I found in my life personally and also with my clients is, as men, we chronically experience relationships as difficult, confusing, hard to understand, like just perplexing, right? And often the first thing we think of, right, is we go, well, I don't understand relationships. And I found some other men who also feel the same as me. So it must be women. Women must be too complicated, right? They're too emotional. They're too demanding. Right? I don't understand what they want. I don't understand what they need. So we put the attention there and assuming the reason relationships are harder because of women. And for a lot of you guys, you just give up, right? Or we start to think that communication is too difficult, too confusing. Like we don't know what we should say, we shouldn't say. We say some things and our partner gets upset, but then we don't say anything, they get upset. So we feel it's really confusing. Or we go to another level, which is we're like, as men, we're not genetically made up to be with one person. So relationships are kind of going against our very nature as human beings, right? Which is a really shit reason, right? Because ultimately living in concrete houses, living in homes, you know, all these things are against our very nature. Sitting in front of a computer is against your very nature. So that doesn't really wash either, right? So we find relationships difficult and we just want to give up. Right? This is something I see time and time again. But none of these things are actually the real issue. None of these things are actually the real problem. They are just what seems to be the problem, or is what's easy to pinpoint, because the problem is a bit deeper and a bit harder to find. But when you solve this problem, right, it's massively, massively more powerful to your dating life, to your relationships, to make you happier. So in this video, what am I going to talk about? Let me just read this off. I'm going to talk about why, as men, we struggle in relationships. I'm going to talk about some personal stories. I might even drop in some stories from my clients, because I wasn't always a relationship coach. I spent many years struggling in relationship. As soon as it got to a couple of months in, I had to find them incredibly difficult, incredibly hard, lots of conflict, lots of stress. Right? I'm going to explain why it's not your fault. Why it's not your fault as a man, why you're not good at relationships, but why it is your responsibility, because that's a really important thing. There's a lot of things that's not your fault, but they're also your responsibility, right? What does it look like when you're struggling in relationship? Because sometimes we just think this is how relationships are, right? And our relationships actually are really not healthy, not good for us, but we don't realize that. And we think our partner's just complaining because they like complaining, right? When actually you're not stepping up as a man and showing up as a man. And then I'm going to talk about why certain bits of advice really fail for men, right? And why it really fails. Because I think when it comes to the relationship and dating world, I think predominantly the narrative and the stories and the column inches and the conversations are by women, right? So it's from a woman's point of view of men and not always how it is for men, which I basically talk about on my channel here and on my podcast. And then I'm going to go into what you need to do to have happier, healthier relationships, right? Almost lost my words there. And here's the thing. Relationships feel hard because there's a particular set of ingredients that you don't know about. Some men do know it, right? You might think it's natural to some degree. It's natural or it's nurtured. It's more likely nurtured, right? But you don't have, if you're listening to this, or you're a woman and you're wondering why, you keep meeting men who can't do relationships. It's maybe because you're attracted to men who have these particular hallmarks, right? Maybe your father or the men in your life had these hallmarks when you grew up, and that's what you see as healthy love. That's one of the big reasons why we're attracted to people that aren't good for us, is because it feels familiar to us. A little adage there, right? So guys, what I'm saying here is you're not broken. You're not doomed. You're not going to be alone forever, right? You doesn't mean you're going to be without a relationship forever, but there are certain things you need to do. You need to learn, you need to embody, you need to try, you need to push through, right? So that you can start to have the happier, healthy relationship you want. So I feel like I've been going on a lot of it, right? So let me tell about myself, right? So I grew up, young man in London, and I wasn't particularly attractive to women, I don't think, until I was probably in my early, like my late teens, 18, 19. I went to university. And I got reasonably good at the first part, meeting women, talking, laughing, joking, having conversation. And I guess and the various reasons why I was good at that, but I got quite good at that, right? But then when it came to the relationship part, I'd always have the same experience. Lots of miscommunication, lots of not understanding, what she wants, what she's talking about, what she's in need of. And then I'd do certain things, and she'd get upset, and I'd get frustrated, and then I wouldn't necessarily talk. I would shut down. I wouldn't speak. I'd be frustrated. She wouldn't understand. She'd get upset. There was a lot of upset, a lot of conflict, a lot of frustration, right, in relationship. It just constantly happened. And then I would just be like, relationships don't work, and I'd end them. And that's where my mind goes. When things don't go well in a relationship, my mind goes to relationships aren't for me. They don't work. I need to exit. Right. That's a real old story that exists in my mind. So I'm going to talk about something called emotional capacity. Right. And this is a really cornerstone aspect of making relationships work, emotional capacity. Because ultimately, as men, we do not learn emotional capacity. We often learn physical capacity, right? A lot of guys, like me, I played sport. So I play sport, and then I went to the gym. I could hold things. I could push my body in ways that was pretty incredible, right? I could run very fast over short distances, and then I learned to do long distances. But we don't learn emotional capacity, right? That's something we do not learn. And you could look at most women, you might argue that they don't learn physical capacity in the same way, because often they're not as interested in sports, traditionally, not always. I look back at my PE class, and half the girls would just have notes to say why they couldn't do it. Not to say that's like that anymore, but you guys get the drift. Whereas women, I haven't explained what emotional capacity is. Let me tell you. Emotional capacity is the ability to stay present, stay embodied, staying in the body, in the feelings, and responsive while experiencing emotional or relational intensity or difficulty, right? Or even a positivity. So you get what I mean, right? It's staying there in the moment when the difficulty, when the intensity, when the emotions start to arise, right? Instead of shutting down, withdrawing, going silent, dissociating, which is like just almost like leaving your body. You start thinking about being somewhere else, or even being distracted, that can show up as, right? Or getting angry, getting really reactive. That's often where we go. Right? So think of capacity kind of like a cup, right? Imagine this is a tiny cup, right? This is most men's emotional capacity, right? So you pour a little bit of water into the cup. I don't have a cup in front of me. I do, but it's like full of stuff. You start pouring it in, right? You pour stuff into the cup, and then slowly it gets up to here, and it's reached its capacity, right? So then anything else that goes in just leaks out, doesn't it? Just leaks out. You know that. Right? You've been there, you've done that. It just leaks out. So all it takes is for work stress, family stuff happening, not sleeping very well, slight frustration because you've injured your knee, and suddenly your emotional capacity, right? So when your partner's like, hey, I want to talk about a relationship, you're just like, you don't have anything to say. You're overwhelmed. You can't speak. You shut down. Or you become reactive, you get angry, you take things personally. Your emotional capacity is low, right? Because you have a small cup. Now, let's think that you have a bucket. I'm holding an imaginary bucket here, which is like 10 times the size of my little cup, right? It takes a lot for this emotional capacity to get built because it's a big bucket, yeah? So that work stress, like kiddie stress, maybe you got kids, your mum's giving you some stuff, you got some intensity because you got like an exam coming up or a promotion or an appraisal coming up, but you still want a lot of space, right? So when your partner comes to you and she's like, hey, I want to talk about a relationship, you're like, okay, cool. I've got space. You feel like you have space in your mind. Your mind doesn't feel cluttered. It doesn't feel like you're just about to be like overwhelmed or you're already overwhelmed. You feel pretty spacious. You almost feel quite calm and relaxed. You're like, okay, cool. We can do this. Maybe there's a little bit of fear of like, oh, I don't know what she's going to say. Maybe she's going to want to break up with me. I don't know. And then she starts to talk and you're listening. And maybe even the stress level's right, but you still feel a spaciousness. You still feel an ability to be present, to feel yourself, whatever's happening, and be responsive to what she's saying, not the projection of what you're saying, what you think she's saying, right? And respond. See, I've explained it really well there, right? What it isn't, what emotional capacity isn't talking about your feelings endlessly, right? I think sometimes that's kind of like emotional availability, or even kind of an like emotional vomiting, where we talk about our feelings endlessly, right? We don't do anything about them. Or we don't particularly feel them as emotions. We just talk about them intellectually. This emotional capacity is not being calm all the time, because often what we think is being calm all the time is actually emotionally shut down or emotionally disassociated, right? This is something that we can appear calm on the exterior, right? Because we're not reacting, but actually inside we are turmoil and we are full to the brim, right? You know that feeling where, you know, on the outside, you're just kind of sitting there like this and nodding. And someone's like, wow, this dude's so calm. I'm firing him. And this dude is just sitting here nodding away. Or your partner's telling you that she slept with your best friend and you're like, okay, cool. Yeah. All right. That's not great. You're not reacting. It seems like you're calm. It might even seem like you don't care. But ultimately what's happening is internally, you're experiencing the chaos. You're experiencing the overwhelm, the emotion, the shutdown of not wanting to speak, of not being able to feel what's going on. You have reached your emotional capacity. So it's not about looking calm all the time. And then the last one I say, it's not about understanding all the terms and psychology. I think in this day and age where we can get access to information whenever we want, right? Because we've got the internet, and it's gone from the internet, we've got AI. So if you want to know about the science of your emotional capacity and why you shut down, you can learn all the terms. You can learn about probably some bits I'm going to tell you in a bit. You can learn about all of it, right? But this doesn't help you stop it from happening. It doesn't help you grow your capacity by knowing all the things. And I think we often mistake knowledge with skill level. It's a bit like reading every book you can find on football tactics and how to kick the ball well and how to do all sorts of crazy swerves and take free kicks, but you never actually get on the pitch and kick the ball. You know, I talk about football for my US people. I'm talking about soccer. You know, Messi didn't become one of the best players ever, right? Because he read all the books, or that he went on ChatGPT and learned about football. He was on the pitch from the age of like 4 or 5 years old. He was in the game. He was playing. He was practicing, making mistakes. And this is a really important part of emotional capacity. You've got to be willing to be in it to grow it and make it bigger. And your luck is in, right? Your emotional capacity isn't fixed. It isn't fixed. You don't grow up with a small capacity and then you're fucked, and then that's how it is forever. It isn't. Your emotional capacity grows over time. This is really important for you to know, right? Your emotional capacity grows over time. So, little stat here, right? Research from the Gottmans, who are a wonderful couple, and they've got an institute, they've done loads of amazing research around relationships, a lovely old couple, shows that emotional flooding shuts down the cognitive processing, problem solving, and empathy in conflict, right? And emotional flooding occurs to men more, right? It occurs to men more, which is when like the emotions and feelings you experience, they basically cause your brain to start to shut down, or the prefrontal cortex, the thing we love to, mentally masturbate around, this kind of conscious mind, this part of the mind that's really around like problem solving, as I said, like the thinking part, the executive part of the brain. That's what the words I'm looking for. It starts to shut down, right? So ultimately what happens is, kind of, I've said this already, is when your body becomes overwhelmed, when you become overwhelmed emotionally, your brain goes offline. You stop thinking like a human being, like an adult, and you probably start thinking like a child, because we often, what I've seen in myself and clients, is we revert back to our childhood behavior, right? Which is sometimes it's, for you, might have been tantrums. So you start screaming and shouting. Right? You start reacting emotionally in that way, like outwardly reacting emotionally. Or maybe like myself, you start to shut down and stop speaking. You're just thinking about a way to get out. How can I say something to get out of this as fast as possible? You're trying to run away. That is something that I see time and time again. When we become overwhelmed, we go back to base programming, right? We become stressed and overwhelmed. So why do men specifically struggle when it comes to emotional capacity and relationships? Right. So I think the first part we have to start with is the point of one. We are undertrained. We are undertrained. I want to tell you about the study that before I get into this, right? And I see this. Studies on emotional socialization, right, show that boys receive significantly less emotional coaching language than girls in early childhood. This starts before the boy has left the womb. We start talking to boys and girls differently before they leave the womb. Everyone's going to go, no, I don't do that. I'm going to talk to my children the same. You don't. Because unconsciously, we have a template of how a boy should be and a girl to be. We can do our best to kind of rage against that. But ultimately, it's there, right? And boys through their lives are discouraged from expressing emotions like fear, sadness, struggles, and so forth. It just happens slowly, right? And the society is changing. It is changing. But, I'm 40 years old, so this happened to me in the 80s and 90s, right? And I definitely remember people telling me not to cry. Like, you'll be fine. I find myself having to notice that one of my own child with Bjorn, like, oh, you're okay. Oh, it's going to be okay. Actually, especially when it becomes verbal, he's like going, how do you feel? Instead of it's going to be okay, because by saying it's going to be okay, you're actually just trying to shut down his feeling and emotion. You're telling him, I don't want your feelings and emotions here, right? I know we mean well. We do it with kids. We do it for adults as well. But we are emotionally undertrained as men. Again, this isn't your fault, but it becomes your responsibility if you want to have happy, healthy relationships, right? So what this teaches us as boys is we suppress our emotions. We have to kind of self-regulate our own, meaning we have to be on our own to understand our emotions, right? Or just to feel into an okay state. We should avoid emotional expression. We should avoid any vulnerability as well. And then we don't learn the skills of communicating how we feel, communicating our feelings and feeling safe to communicate, right? So this is something I see with men a lot. They don't feel safe to communicate their feelings and emotions. As soon as they have to do that, even with me, when I'm trained to listen to them and they know it's safe because they've listened to the podcast like you guys, they've come to my workshops. They are like, okay, I'm feeling like this. And when I ask them questions and, in that time, I'm sitting there and I'm just listening. I've got no judgment about men's feelings. I've heard all sorts in my time. So they see it on my face, they feel it in my presence, and then they start to relax and they start to open up more because I'm asking questions because I'm curious, right? But most men have never had that experience, especially with other guys, right? Sometimes we get it with the women in our lives and we become more relaxed in doing so, and that's really good for us, but it can mean that we end up using the women in our lives as emotional processors or putting all our emotions on them to be with us with, and that becomes a burden as well. It should be a burden we share across the people in our lives, the important people in our lives. So it means that we don't learn the practice of emotions. And I'll talk about myself here. When I was again in my 20s, I would have said at the time that I'm a pretty, emotionally intelligent person. I have conversations with my friends about sadness and anger and frustration. But when I was in relationship, just any conflict would just be I would just shut down. I couldn't be in the conversation. I thought I could be, but I was just projecting what I thought was happening. I became almost instantly overwhelmed. Partners I'm not happy about this in a relationship. I became defensive. Yeah, that's another sign of kind of emotional overwhelm often. I become defensive. I became counterattacking where I'd be like, no, this is your fault because you do this, this, and this. I was undertrained in being in those sorts of conversations. I was undertrained in feeling my emotions and being open and discussing them and not taking their emotions personally, something I did a lot with women. A second point is, and this is a second point here, so I know it's a second point again, is that we don't practice, we don't get the reps. When you go to gym, I just went to the gym this morning and I was doing chest. Yeah, I do chest once a week. And I'm pushing, boom, boom, boom. I do 20 reps at the moment because I'm trying to get leaner. So you do 20 reps, right? Well, you're not doing the reps because you don't do one. You don't open up to your friends. You don't even do that one rep of like saying how you feel really. You just go, I'm fine. So he's like, the bar doesn't even leave your chest. So you don't grow your capacity, right? You have to think of capacity in the same way you think of gym. Now, you might go to the gym for the first time. Some of you guys might remember the first time you went gym if you've been to the gym. You got that bell, that 20 kg bell. I don't know what it is in the USA. I hope it's also 20 kg. It just makes sense. It's Olympic bell bar. And you try to push that bar. And you were like you were rowing. Yeah? That's what happens, right? You have to get the reps in. You got no capacity for it. You couldn't do that 10 times. You couldn't do it with one arm. Because you had done no reps. But once you start repping, once you start practicing week in, week out, you're doing chest once a week. Suddenly, 6 months later, you got 20s on each side. You're doing 60 kg. You feel like a G. Yeah? You feel like a boss now. You feel like, yeah, I can do this gym thing, I can do it. You start to believe in yourself. You hear that? You start to tell yourself positive reinforcements about how you've improved and how you've got better. We don't get to do this as men. Yeah? By and large, we don't do this. Right? So it means that we don't grow in capacity. So we're walking around, most men walking around with untrained emotional capacity, untrained chest, got flat chest, got, no chest muscle, no emotional muscles. So we're lacking the emotional muscle to create relationships and connect, right? So when you have the capacity, you're like, okay, she comes to me with conflict. I sit here. She's telling me about something she's upset with. You're like, oh, that makes me feel something, but I'm not reacting to it because, I'm still spacious. I've got more capacity. I've got a bucket instead of a little cup. Okay, she wants this. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, okay. Yeah, she wants more time together, or she wants to feel more affectionate, or, okay, she's asked me to communicate in this way. Okay, cool. You go, okay, yeah, I understand that. I understand where you're coming from. There's a bit of empathy here. It's another thing we don't really get taught as men is empathy, stepping into someone else's shoes and trying to understand what they feel instead of being in kind of competition. Like we need to win. If she's saying this, that's against me. It's us, me versus her. And then you start to understand and be able to communicate. And then you might communicate how you feel. You might go, I feel that this was a little bit harsh that you're saying this. I feel like I've been trying a lot. But you're staying in this range to a certain degree of calmness and connectedness, being co-regulated in a co-regulated space with your partner instead of reacting or shutting down, which is non-relational. Yeah, there's no relating can happen where one person shuts down or one person is overreacting. Yeah, this. So one of the reasons why this happens for us men is because we have less friendships. We have less closer friendships where emotions are something that we share. As you know, I run a community. And when this comes out, there'll still be some time and space for you to join the community, because one of the things we do is we do the reps. Because ultimately, we have to practice being in this emotional state and sharing and opening up and listening. And you're doing the reps. Right? So inside the community there on, we do the reps like this because we're having sessions where we're sharing things and we do things outside, like we use things in person, UK, London-based stuff in person. And then there's the sessions I run, coaching sessions and workshops inside the community where I ask questions and people get to share and they go off into breakout rooms and they do things, they share together. We're practicing the reps. We're getting the reps in, right? And then in my program that's coming out called Relate, which is really guiding you in the myriad of skills of good relating, because emotional capacity is just one. We will be practicing various things to start to increase your capacity. Yeah, we're not just going to do the talking because that's important, but we're going to do other practices that are body-based, somatic practices, right? To start to build your capacity for emotions. Because as men, we don't do that early on. So I'm giving you this education, helping you with this education. You miss out early in life, because as men, what we often do is our friendships are based on activity, sport, tiddlywinks, chess. Even when I was in my 20s, a lot of my activities were based on going and meeting women. Some of my friends, we bonded over the fact that we were not that great at meeting women and we wanted to get better. So we went out a lot together, right? But it was still focused on an external thing, not on our internal world. So in my 20s, we started to talk about our fear of rejection, give each other feedback about, how an interaction went, what sort of energy we bore, if we were being curious or fun in the interaction. So it was a bit of that, but there wasn't as much now as like when I meet my friend. I met a friend of mine the other night And we sat down across the table for each other for 3 hours and just talked about how he's been feeling in his marriage and how I've been feeling in my relationship, how things are with fatherhood. We just talked about what was going on for us and some geopolitics as well. But we don't have as many of those relationships, men, you know, and I have men in my life that way. I have probably like 10 men in my life who I have those sorts of conversations with, yeah, on a regular basis of like a monthly or kind of every couple of months, or we do that. So if you're interested in learning some of that skill and you've enjoyed these podcast episodes and videos, then there's some stuff down below to get you to the community. If that should still be open. It's open till mid-February, the 10th of February, sorry. And Relate, which is a program starting in March. So you can put your name down on the wait list there as well. So back into what I'm saying. How does a lack of capacity show up in relationship? I know this one well. I've mentioned some of these things already. You know, for you, it's going to show up as like withdrawing. And when I say withdrawing, it's like, it's not always you withdraw yourself. Sometimes you do. You will just hide. You know, you'll be working late. You'll be on your phone distracted. You'll be in your home office working. You'll just choose to be in another room from your partner. You'll be distracted watching sport instead of being together. That's a type of withdrawal. Another type of withdrawal, which is kind of what I call shutting down, and Mrs. Commune shutting down, is where you just don't really speak. You could be in the presence, but you're not really speaking. Another thing that can be a sign of kind of a lack of emotional capacity is kind of over-explaining or intellectualizing. So over-explaining where we are like giving like logical, reasonable understanding to someone for what's happening for us without really feeling it or without really describing how we're feeling. I did this because of this and that and that, and because of this, surely that makes sense to you. Well, we just talking without really being completely present. Or intellectualizing, which can look a lot like overthinking, where we just go into our minds and we're explaining, we're justifying, we're explaining, you know, what happened in relation to our wounds and our past experiences. Another one that can show up in your relationship is defensiveness. I did a whole podcast episode recently about defensiveness. You can search for that pretty easy. It's probably only in the last kind of 5 weeks to 2 months that went out. Did a whole episode about defensiveness. Fixing instead of listening. This is a really important one. As men, something we often pride ourselves in is the way that we want to help is to solve people's problems. It's very admirable. It comes from a good place often in like cognitively, consciously, it comes from a good place. But our desire to fix often comes from our uncomfortability with someone, the emotional state that someone's telling us about. They start saying they're struggling with work and they're really getting them down and they don't want to go into the office. And then we go, well, just get a new job. Just leave, get a new job. When actually what they're in need of is for you to listen to them. If your partner just wants you to listen to them. She might be talking about her job and how she's feeling and for you to be curious with her, right? But that's missing for you. Another one is around sex, which is a kind of shutdown that happens sexually. And I see this a lot with men where they're struggling with emotional capacity and their capacity for intimacy and closeness actually can be quite low, because what happens is what they have to face when they're in intimacy, in sexual intimacy in particular with their partner, is their fears around performance, the fears about not being good enough, fears about, you know, not showing up well, not doing it right. Sometimes the fears around not knowing what they like, right? So all those fears come up and they fill up their little emotional capacity and they want to exit. They don't want to go into it. They don't want to go there, right? So something is really important, because I like to reiterate this. It's like, this is not a character flaw. This is not like, again, I say you're not broken. There's not something wrong with you. Like, I did all these things. Withdrawing, over-explaining, defensiveness, like fixing instead of listening. I was the king of fixing instead of listening. I would listen for 5 minutes and then be like, boom, 2 lines, that's your solution. Let's stop talking about this, you know? And sexual shutdown, right? And fear around sex, for sure. So it's not a character flaw. It's just like a capacity limit. It's like a balloon that needs to stretch, right? And as we said before, you didn't get this schooling, right? You didn't get this like nurturing that happens underneath what's happening in your life. Yeah. It's not a skill set that you learn from a young age, right? This emotional skill set that often happens. So something that's really important to just finish off this bit is like, when we say we need space often, right? Not always, but most of the time when a man says, I need space, right? What he's really saying is I don't have capacity to really be with what you're saying right now. I don't have capacity to be present right now. Now, if you can start to say that to your partner, instead of I just need space, actually your relationship will transform, because that's a form of communication. It's a form of emotional communication that can be useful to them. It gives them more information, but you're still left with the capacity issue, right? That needs to be worked on. And one of the capacity issues, before I jump into the next section, is actually is around having ways to empty your cup, as they say it, right? But actually, I'm gonna drop that towards the end. Yeah, ways to empty your cup, because it doesn't fit right here. So, why communication advice for men fails? Why does it most of it fail? The reason why most communication advice for men fails is because it's really trying to tell men to communicate when they're overwhelmed, which is something that's actually really, really difficult, right? If you're overwhelmed, it's actually the thing that's hard is to make sense of what is going on. You're overwhelmed. Your mind is busy. You've got all these like conflicting thoughts. You've got thoughts that you know aren't really true, for you are, things that you're like, or you just feel really like, it feels like too much. So even if I teach a man to communicate well, if he's overwhelmed, right, it's not going to help him, because all he's been able to say is, I'm overwhelmed. And it can become this kind of like record, because you're constantly saying to your partner, hey, I'm overwhelmed. I need some time, I'm overwhelmed, right? So teaching the right words is useful, but only really useful when he's in a state to be able to connect emotionally to what he's feeling and have the emotional literacy in those words to express it, right? Because that's often what we get told as men. We just need to communicate more. If you communicate more, everything will be fine. But actually, if you're overwhelmed, your communication isn't really that useful. So, what builds emotional capacity, right? What builds the capacity to stay present, open, embodied when there's emotional intensity? What does it? Because this is really important, right? Because if it's not just your relationship this comes up in your work, this comes up with your family, this comes up with your friends, this comes up in the times that, you're in front of a woman you don't know, you're in a date, for instance, and you go blank, you don't know what to say. Or, a big opportunity in life comes up. This emotional capacity piece comes up all over our lives, and we don't always realize, because we don't taught to realize that it's an important thing. What doesn't build emotional capacity, and is very important to say, insight. Thinking doesn't build emotional capacity. It does not build emotional capacity. Often our thinking will decrease our emotional capacity, right? Talking endlessly will not build your emotional capacity. Watching more content will not build your emotional capacity, right? Pretending you have more emotional capacity will not build your emotional capacity. Pretending you're calm and nothing bothers you does not build your emotional capacity. Trust me, I've been there. I've been down many of those roads, right? What does build your emotional capacity is, I'm going to call it embodied awareness, but actually it's like awareness of what it feels like to be inside you, what the emotional landscape is of your being. So what are the emotions you're feeling in your body, the sensations that are there, like that actually starts to build your emotional awareness, right? So that is being, you can do this alone, literally is, okay, I'm having a stressful moment. Stop, close your eyes and scan your body, right? There's a practice that I take men through when we're in one-to-one or in my programs, which is a way to kind of name the feelings and emotions, right? So they can build a capacity to be with, because ultimately your issue with your emotional capacity is that you struggle to be with your emotions. You want to escape, you want to run away from them, right? And you haven't found a way to kind of build that bucket. But also when the emotions are there, you struggle to be with them, right? Really important. That somatic practice of being with your emotions, being able to like be with them, name them, feel them, goes a really long way. Yeah. And I'll go as far to say, I did a practice today. I was feeling a little bit of frustration in my own self. And I did some breath work and I breathed and I allowed myself to feel what was underneath the surface and make a sound and move with it and so forth. And that might sound really wild to you, right? But that's a very healthy way to feel and express your emotions. No one else is going to be in any danger. I'm in a closed space in my office. And I'm making the choice to feel my emotions, growing my capacity, because I'm trusting in my ability to do that. Another way is relational kind of exposure. So what's relational exposure? That is being in relation with your emotions, with someone else. So that could be looking your partner in the eye and them expressing their emotions and you choosing to stay there and having a choice of like, I'm going to stay with this difficulty, this emotion, and I'm going to stay grounded. I'm going to stay present, and being in situations where you're going to start to stretch your emotions instead of trying to run away from them before they start to happen. Because what you often start to do is when conflict arises, you want to nip it in the bud and avoid the conflict. Or when it happens, you want to run away. Yeah. It's this kind of choosing to do something different in the moment. So I train this in groups as well, where you get men to be in relational moments. That could just literally be looking at each other. Often men think of relation and we just think of like touch and sex and stuff like that. But it's like being in moments together and given prompts to talk and ways to listen more widely, open ourselves up to hearing and feeling what's going on for the other man, and then expressing what we feel in relation to what he's communicated. That is part of the emotional exposure. Staying in discomfort slightly longer than before. So this can be in, like I'm explaining, conflict where it starts to get uncomfortable and you're choosing to stay. But this also can be in terms of physical things. Like, I believe that something like the co-regulation practices that I do with men sometimes around anger, where we are allowing ourselves to express anger and be witnessed in expressing anger, and also witness I'm a man, builds this capacity to stay in longer, right? So say, for instance, today I'm expressing my frustration. If I start to believe that, I can't do this anymore, this is getting weird, and I choose to stay a few minutes longer, right? That's how I start to expand my capacity, right? Another way to expand my capacity is to ultimately start to heal the old wounds, right? Emotional wounds. Because often what happens is when it comes to our emotions, there is a lot of emotion that we just are carrying from a long time ago. This like dusty old emotion that's been sitting there for 20 years. The frustration at your dad that he was never there for you. The frustration of your mum because she did something to you as a kid, or the sadness that you're feeling because of the first girl you loved dumped you, or the grief you have from a past relationship, or the resentment you have at your partner because, she's not doing the things you want her to do. This all just sits in your system, and it sits and it takes up a lot of your cup. So some men, your cup is like 90% full all the time because there's a whole history that you've never cleared out. You've never gone near, right? And that's a really important thing to do. And again, it's the stuff that I do in some of my programs with men. I think that's it. Like making choices and actually breathing. I think in the moment when you are in a difficult moment, what builds your capacity is being able to stay present, which is choosing to breathe and stay there, right? That helps you increase your emotional capacity. Yeah, it makes such a difference. And I think also, I talked about this before, increasing emotional capacity is having more emotionally open conversations with the men in your life, right? And I know a lot of you don't have anyone in your life who can do that. A lot of people told me this. It's a muscle. It happens through practice, right? As well. Over time, you practice and it gets easier. Now, I said there was something else I was going to mention, right? Which is around how you let off out emotion, right? So one of the ways, if you've got a cup and it's kind of half full, but one of the ways you start to reduce that, right, is through the ways in which you deal with past events, right? Things that have been sitting in your system since you were 12, 13, 14, 5, whatever, right? It could be something that happened 2 years ago that you've never really expressed, you never talked about, you never really let yourself free from. So, you've got to kind of work with that. Another thing to mind is just the general stresses and strains that life throws at us. Because we have a habit of men is we feel stuff and we just kind of allow it to contract in us. Yeah. We don't express how we feel. We don't let it move for us. We don't feed it in our systems. What we do is we just take on stress and it builds, and we think that's normal. We think how we feel is normal because it becomes normalized. So it's having things you do that allow you to release those things regularly, like friendship. community, things that are meaningful, like people who are going to ask you questions that you won't ask yourself. Yeah. That's a really important one. People will ask you questions that you won't ask yourself so that you can answer them and you can start to feel them. Certain embodiment practices and somatic practices to feel your emotions and let go of some of that. Having difficult conversation in relationship, tackling the resentments you have in your relationship as well, for instance, is a way we turn the valve. And for some of you, sports and so forth can be, I know a lot of guys go, gym is my therapy. It's not quite good enough. It can help a little bit, but it's not good enough. It won't be, you can't just use one thing to clear out all of your feelings and emotions. You need a mixture of, some of it's going to be through words, some of it's going to be through movement, but ultimately you have to be at least touching the stuff that's there. Just going to the gym and pushing the weights is a form of kind of repression. We're just pushing it down. Yeah. It does help, movement does help the body release stuff. It does. But it can't be your only one. You need to have a varied amounts of taps so that you're letting off these bits of steam, you're letting off the stress and strains of life on a regular basis. Fantastic. So I've told you all the stuff there, I told you all the stuff, right? We'll start to close up now. Because ultimately, this struggle men have around relationships ties into masculinity. Masculinity being, in this context, is the way that we assume boys and men should be, the traits and ways of being. So we've taken on these scripts of masculinity, and relationships is an area that masculinity shows up for us massively, because it interacts with women, for those of you that are straight. And this is where so much of our stuff comes up, and the way we see ourselves as men, how men should be. Men should be strong and stoic and not speak. And we take that script and we bring it into relationship, and then we wonder why we can't connect with the women in our lives, right? It's about growing your emotional capacity. And if you notice here, I didn't say this is all about, again, endlessly talking about your feelings or being vulnerable all the time, because that doesn't tell the whole picture, right? Because there's some men out there, you need to learn to be more vulnerable. That was my thing. I need to speak more and be more vulnerable. And something I didn't mention when I mention it now is some of us need to learn containment. Emotional containment, like keeping our emotions to ourselves. And the problem is, what happens often is the men who are kind of like I was, stoic and didn't speak how we feel, when I tell about containment, they're like, yeah, see, I'm doing that containment thing, right? And then the guys who are like emotionally open and quite anxious and speaking about how they feel, they hear that like, oh, I need to be more vulnerable, I'm going to do that. And they go and do that. The problem is, it's the wrong advice for you, right? If you find yourself, very anxious and, a bit reactive to people emotionally, you need to practice containment, right? You need to practice not leaking out your emotions instantly all the time. You need to learn to stop, breathe, physically process them, somatically process them and so forth, and then respond, right? And if you're a guy who, you're quite stoic, you don't speak, you don't want to, be vulnerable and so forth, what you actually need is to be more open and vulnerable with your feelings and emotions, right? So we need to come into this middle place, or at least have the range, right, to be stoic in the moments that you need to be, because there are some moments, a very small percentage of moments where you just need to hold your shit together, right? You're in a labor room, as I've been, not last year, year before. There's a moment where, this kind of emotional containment and stoicism is very useful, right? But when your baby's born, yeah, you want to be able to express the joy you feel, whether it's tears, happiness, smiles, you need to be able to express that. But if you can't express that, if you're all stoic and shit and you're just like, yeah, baby came, nice. Yeah. And it's just having the range, but emotional capacity is expanding your range, right? For this. And as I said, this is the work that we do, especially inside of Relate. It's going to happen inside a community. The community is fun. The community is for men who are looking for connection with other men. Most of the guys are UK based, a couple of other guys in Europe. The community is great in that way. Again, the door's shut for that on probably the 8th really of February. We come together, we practice together, we do workshops together, we communicate, we hang out together in person as well. Whereas Relate is better for you if you can see that relationships are hard, dating is hard for you. Even the aspects of leading yourself as a man is difficult for you. If you're really honest with yourself, you're not where you want to be in those areas, then Relate is the program for you. So if you want to, you're interested in those, there's a wait list down below. If it's the community, you got to just drop me an email because there's only a few spaces. As of recording, there's only 3 more spaces left for the community. And I only open up the community every 6 months. So if those things are interesting to you, let me know. As always, any comments, really welcome. Any thoughts, any of your own troubles, actually, like you're struggling with, just drop them in the comments down below, whether that's on Spotify, whether that is on YouTube. And actually, I'll say lastly, if you can just like this video, you can just review it on Spotify or Apple Music. It just goes a really long way to more men getting this message. You know, I have a real passion for helping men when it comes to love and relationships. And this is all free. This is free content for you. Yeah, I don't ask you to pay a penny for this. So do me a favor. Pass it on, like it, share it. Would love you for it. Peace.